Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we come to you this evening asking your presence and your guidance, asking you to lead us and be with us. There was somebody. Okay, we're back live. Because there are people watching. That's the reason I wanted to stop for a second. Okay. Who would like to start?
I can start.
Okay.
Wake up and listen by Rite. I have never been called a man of few words, and at 44 years old, it is a safe gamble that I will never have that said about me. You see, once a year I tell myself that I am sure it will make me a better person to go out in a tent and just be quiet for a while. I have seen other people more spiritual than me do this, and it seems to work great for them. Surely this is the key. Wind, bugs, running water, my fidgeting around trying to get comfy, the inevitable scream from some poor camper far away from me as they swat another mosquito. This is not a quiet place. Often I am amazed at just how loud everything is. I wonder what I'm doing wrong. But I listen.
I have that reading. It's more of a commentary. I thought it was really loud thing.
I admit I have not learned from these annual trips how to be silent, quiet, and still. In fact, it typically takes another year for me to talk myself into doing it again. But what I have learned from the loud forest is that so much is going on in the world and I never listen to it at all. These trips have been God slapping me in the face, telling me that all of this is going on around me in my everyday life. Wake up and listen.
In today's gospel, Jesus walks into a temple and starts stirring over tables. He is telling people to listen to what is going on around them. It could be said that his whole life was about telling everyone to look outside themselves and listen to their neighbors and love the people around them. I've been blessed recently to be a part of an eye-opening small group on race and justice. And in these gatherings, I have come to realize that I haven't been listening for a long time. As a white heterosexual man, I was doing what I could to be a good person while people around me didn't have the same opportunities and chances to do good on their own lives. I wasn't noticing that they weren't in discussion or even at the table. Like in the forest, it was not about being quiet, but about listening. What is going on around you today that you are not listening to?
I don't know if y'all know who Randall Curtis is, but Randall Curtis is our youth and young adult, I can't remember exactly, director, what his title is, but he works in the bishop's office. And so this actually comes from someone local.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that first statement couldn't have been more than true. Bless his heart. And when he and I get on the phone together, we have to find a way to get off the phone because we both talk a lot when we get on the phone together, so I'm not just picking on him. But I thought that was interesting. The other thing I will tell you, the last thing I could have ever imagined him doing is going out and getting in a tent somewhere. It would be almost as strange as me going out and getting in a tent somewhere. So to imagine him opening up in a way to really share that was really interesting for me to hear. But I think he spoke a lot when he talks about going out in the woods, and you think that going out, it's going to be quiet. And often what you find is, even in the quiet, there's a lot of noise. And so in reading this and thinking about listening and quiet and his response to how do we hear others, I really appreciated this whole picture of thinking. I shared this last week, Patsy, is I've tried to concentrate a lot during October on exploring racism, what my piece of that is, how it affects me, how my attitudes affect others, how I fit into the picture. And so the whole thought of what he was talking about really, I think, speaks volumes that we as white people try to understand, but I think have to be open to hearing others in how they receive what we get and how we react. And so I think in this lesson for me, there's two sides to it. It's how does the world perceive us, or how do we perceive the world, and how do we live in the world? And how are we living in the spiritual part of that? How are we living with God and that whole sense of how are we listening? How are we hearing? How are we interacting with God? How are we interacting spiritually even with each other? Are we listening to each other, not just the day-to-day, but are we listening to each other's soul, the soul language that happens, the spiritual language that happens between us? Those are all things that came to mind when I read and thought about this lesson. And I know Sylvia reached out to me and asked me about, she had some thoughts on it as well. Are those things that you're ready to share, or is there?
Yeah, you have some of those already on the board, like here in terms of so if we look at hearing versus listening, what are your thoughts about that? What is the difference?
Well, with listening, in nursing we call it active listening. And unless you are actively listening, then you're not hearing. You can hear words. You can hear it all day long. But if you don't actively listen and try to understand what the other person is saying, you haven't really heard them.
Well, we talk about that in the leadership at the very beginning for the cadets in Civil Air Patrol, in the whole section on listening versus hearing. And you have to listen for the meaning, listen for the message that they're trying to send, not just the words. And so often we listen and respond. While you're talking to me, I'm thinking, what can I say back when they get done?
And then you're really not listening when you do that. You are not actively listening when you're already preparing what you're going to say. Then really you're anticipating what I'm going to say, and you haven't really heard.
Especially if they say something controversial, something that I'm very passionate about, or something that I very much disagree with, that automatically can set me on, I'm going to review what they just said, or, oh my gosh, I can't wait to tell you what I know about this.
I think another thing that helps us differentiate is that hearing really is an automatic physiological function. We don't have control over that. It just happens. For those of us who are fortunate enough to have the hearing ability. We're listening, so hearing is effortless. It's automatic. Now listening really requires an effort on our part. It's not an automatic response. So we might even appear that we're listening, but we're not. Sometimes not even hearing. And there was something that I think was in one of the readings this week that they talked about the listening to our body and with our bodies. And I also thought that was a good way of looking at it. Listening with our body and listening to the body. So in terms of listening even to our own bodies, what's my body telling me? Am I hungry? Am I tired? Am I stressed? And then if I'm listening to you, what is your body telling me?
Yeah, the body language.
The body language, exactly.
one of the things that talks about, if you're actively listening and leaning forward, when you're into the conversation, if you're talking to somebody and they've got their arms crossed and they're just like glaring at you, that pretty much tells you real quick they're not listening and they don't care.
Which is interesting, because that's the closed response. But I do that a lot, and I really am listening. And so I find myself trying to keep my arms from doing it. It's just a natural, sort of comfortable pose, but it's the body language. It's a body language of being close, even though that's not what it is to me.
It's a comfort for me.
Right. But it indicates, our body language indicates that we're close, even if we're not. That's what.
And I think a lot of it has to do with if you're around somebody that you know, when you're more comfortable with them, crossing your arms, stuff like that. I know that you're still listening. If you know me, if I'm standing there, if I'm sitting here like this, that's because I'm relaxed and I'm involved in the conversation, not because I'm not listening to you.
And so we have to be in this listening. We have to understand who. Who are we talking to or listening to?
There's a poster, it's been out for decades, and it talks about prayer. And the simple statement is, prayer starts with talking to God, and it ends by listening to God. So being quiet for that still, small voice, is sometimes hard for me. Sometimes a lot.
And being quiet is a part of listening, but it's not necessarily same as listening. You can be quiet and then again not listening. And then what you were saying about the active listening, you're quiet, but you're also acknowledging the person or saying or maybe
reiterating what they said, or asking questions.
asking questions, exactly.
Some cultures will, it's just part of their culture to nod in agreement, and they don't, you have to ask questions in order to make sure they really understood it.
Well, there's a joke, just smile and nod.
Yeah.
And we use that with a certain member of our family that most of us don't agree with their ideology and thoughts. And so he'll start on one of his little tirades and we just,
Well, that was the Southern way of doing things. That's nice.
That's been taught for as long as I can remember. When if somebody's saying something, you just smile and nod.
So I think that's, thinking about the quiet. So quiet can be, I'm being quiet to hear what you have to say because my brain is really functioning to respond. Or I can be resting in the quiet to just get through what you're saying, because it is so, maybe from what you were talking about, Miranda, it's so appalling to me that my quiet is not because I'm hearing you, though I am hearing you. It's more of I'm trying to keep myself settled in that moment.
I'm trying not to respond in a way that would be equally offensive to what you say.
Right. And then there's the quiet, like Randall talks about being in the woods, where it is a quiet, but it's a different quiet. It's a self-quiet, even though there's all this going on around us. And I think that's part of the quiet that this reading kind of relates to me. Even in church, you hear people, kind of like what we talked about last week with Rosie. Rosie sometimes would get kind of loud, but really it wasn't always Rosie, but those stage whiskers that would come out. But what is interesting is even in noise you can have quiet. Even in all that's going on around us, we can be quiet in ourselves to take in all of that. Because sometimes I think it's in our quietness in ourselves, and maybe quietness is not the right word, I don't know, but just being and absorbing all that's going on around us helps us to understand other people, helps us to truly hear them in a different way. We're taking in their body language, their words, what is going on in the world around us as we're having these conversations or being in these places. It comes to mind to me, you're in a place where you're in a protest or something like that, and all these things are going on around you that you're absorbing that are part of the meaning of what's happening.
We're the distractions, not being distracted.
Yeah.
If you're having a conversation with somebody, if we're setting up in the office in the mornings, we may all be, chatting, but we all may also just be sitting there on our phones for a few minutes or something like that. But if I come in and say, hey, I really need to talk to you, then I know that you're not going to have your phone out checking emails or messages or something like that, and that's part of it. If you're trying to have a serious conversation with somebody and you're having to compete with their phone, or if the TV's on and you keep noticing them watching TV, then you know that they're not really paying attention to you. And
Except for, like what I do with the kids, I give them a distraction and they hear better.
yeah,
So you have to, I think that's another thing we have to be mindful of, is how do people listen?
Or how do they learn?
Or how do they learn? Do they really learn in the quiet? Or, I always remember this, I studied with something else.
I was going to say, I've got in homeschooling, and my oldest, she needed silence. Like, she were noise canceling headphones part of the time. As she got older, she would listen to music while she studied. That one cannot handle quiet. If there is quiet, she cannot focus. So she'll have a video going and music going, and she'll be sitting there doing her schoolwork. I'm like, I can't focus to help you because there's too many distractions. We gotta come to a compromise here.
But that's part of the listening.
Yeah.
You listen to what she needs, even though you're not thinking about it as being listening. It is, because you're still hearing someone else's need. But it's not in words. It's in actions.
One of the things, I read an excerpt from the one, Like Fragility, the one that wrote Like Fragility.
Oh, yeah, but I can't
D'Angelo,
remember.
is it D'Angelo or something like that?
Yes, it is D'Angelo.
And in that she shared,
Robin D'Angelo.
yes, an experience she had with another woman who happened to be of color. And she treated that person like she would treat anybody. She interrupted and, and seemed rather rude. And the other person called her out on it after the meeting, saying, but she called her racist because she disrespected her. But that was her perspective. And it was D'Angelo that realized that, oh my gosh, because her reply immediately was, I do that to everybody. That's just how I am. But from the other person's perspective, which is what I think we have to be aware of, that type of behavior is considered, it goes back generations, how their ancestors were treated, and that equates to being disrespectful. And then that equates to being racist because of the person of color. But we have to be aware.
But it's not just a person of color.
No.
It could be a man interrupting a woman. It's how, I think what I got from that is we have to remember the hierarchy. And if we can remember who we are in that hierarchy, then sometimes we have to really put ourselves in a different place. So, as a man interrupting a woman, it can be seen as disrespectful. As a white person interrupting a person of color, it's disrespectful, even though that's not how we meant it.
Right.
But understanding that the privilege comes from being a white male and works its way down, in order to really listen and understand someone, their language, they're literally listening to them, we have to stop and say, okay, how is this perceived from their perspective? And I think that really is important.
Well, there's kind of an element of empathy in listening. It's actually being sensitive to the other.
Well, I know one of the things, and Zoe actually texted me this, when she's listening to somebody, she'll doodle, she'll draw. And more than once in different places, I've had to go to, if it was a co-op class, I'd say something to the teacher, or if she was in class at church, I'd say something to her teacher. She is listening. And I actually had a teacher tell me one time after one of our homeschool classes, I didn't think she was paying a little bit of attention, so I started asking her questions, and she was able to answer every one of them. I was like, if she's doing something with her hands, movement, keeping herself busy, so that she's not fidgeting, she's paying attention.
Helps and focus.
Well,
I was the same way.
but you know what that tells me? Because I'm an educator, that tells me she's a kinesthetic learner. And I used to tell my students that were kinesthetic learners, they'd have to come with me with their learning styles. And I'd tell them, oh, you're kinesthetic. Well, you can't really get up and do things during lecture, but you can sit there and you can do your wrist like this, or you can do your shake your foot or something, and it really makes a difference on their ability to listen and comprehend.
And I think we change over time.
We do.
I find myself when I go to conferences, I stand in the back of the room if I can, because I can stand rather than sit and listen. Because if I sit and listen for very long, I lose it. I'm not hearing anymore. But if I stand, somehow it works to keep my attention towards that.
I take notes.
Right?
I take very detailed notes.
So, when we think about that story, everybody knows what the biblical story is when Jesus goes in and turns over the tables. So, if we're trying to listen, and we're looking at maybe this as being the two, actually all four of these really, but to prepare a space, to hear the voices, the centering, how does that story connect with this whole idea of really all of these?
Well, Jesus was removing the distractions. Was he not? Talking about turning over the table.
But was he just, what else was he doing? What else was Jesus doing in this story? What was his language to the people in the temple when he turned over the table?
It was
I'm sorry, angry?
Yeah. He made a whip of cords. He was angry.
What else? Was he anything else?
He was offended.
Offended?
I would say he was sad. It sounds kind of corny, but to see what his father's house had been turned into.
What
A
about,
person upset.
what about claim? Was he claiming space?
Oh, could be, yeah, sure.
So his language was about claiming the space and showing his anger. But he wasn't just angry. He was angry why? He was sad why? Why were those, what would we hear him say in that action? I mean, because he didn't really, he said a little bit, but most of it was action. So what did we hear from this body language? I mean, I know we heard these things, but these are emotions. So what did we hear from this?
But you don't belong here.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, something like
You don't belong here.
Oh,
This is not a space for this kind of activity.
This is a holy place, and
This is a holy
to make it
place.
very unholy.
Or your activities don't belong.
Right, yes, yeah, it's really not.
this is something that kind of perplexes me. He says, his disciples remember that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me.
What does that say to you? Zeal from your house.
And that, you know, it's almost like you're so excited about,
Zeal for your house?
yeah, about what you can get from it, about, you know, zeal means, I can't remember now, but passion. Yeah. Passion for what they were doing. But then I think what confused me was last year's Lenten message by that professor from, is it Vanderbilt?
Oh, yeah. Amy Jill Levine.
Yes. And she explained to us why they were doing that. Because of the, you know, they could only present shekels, wasn't it?
A certain coin. It had to be a holy coin.
Yeah.
But
So they had a purpose.
they did have a purpose, but their purpose turned into profit.
Oh, that's right.
As opposed to,
Okay.
but think about this. I think Miranda was the only one that didn't hear last week's sermon. What does this say to you in context of last week's sermon? Or do I need to tell you what I said in last week's sermon? I know people hear, but they don't necessarily remember after the sermon's over. Zeal for your house will consume me.
I think that it's almost like another God other than you.
Remember I talked about the rituals and the whole rubrics of the prayer book. If you don't do it, if you don't bow right or kneel at the right time, or I think that has something to do with what he's saying. This whole idea, and this could come from the fact that he's saying you're so in your head about what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it that you quit listening for what truly is important. You quit hearing, you quit doing this praying, beginning by talking to God and listening to that response. Because if you're listening to that response, the zeal is not going to be for the house, it's going to be for each other and the Spirit that dwells here. I mean, I don't know if that's truly what it, but that's just what all that says to me, is that, you know, it's part of that, for some people coming into the church, it's really important, and I grew up with it, that it's quiet when they come in. It's a time to prepare themselves for the service, and so they want it to be a quiet space. And then other people, in that quietness, they aren't really, it doesn't do the same thing for them. And so I think that speaks to us as to how are we listening to each other even as we come into worship?
When I was in college, one of the things, I have ADHD. Anybody who knows me for more than, just a few minutes can usually tell me that. And at one point in, I think my junior or senior year, up to that point I had managed on my own. And finally I had one class where I ended up having to go to the ADA and go, look, I need one accommodation. I need to be able to sit in the front row right in front of where the teacher instructs so I can pay attention. There's a kid who won't quit taking my seat. Can you put on paper that I need that seat? And he goes, oh no, we can do that. Because he was doing it for science. And he needed the seat, I could have worked with it, but he was doing it for science. So, and he's like, oh, well, you have ADHD, so you can have extra time on your assignments, you can have this, you can go through the test in the learning assistance center and by yourself. That was the biggest mistake I ever did. I did it once. I got person's getting up, they're starting to finish the test, I need to stay on task. And I think that's similar, with church, because if I come in and it's really quiet, I get distracted really easy.
He heard you, but he didn't listen to you.
And so people like you walking around the front, when I see you starting to get ready, when I see whoever is doing the reading, lighting candles, those are all visual cues that, hey, I need to start focusing on this. So I can see both sides, how it would help somebody with it being really quiet, and other people need those cues. So it can be a double-edged sword.
So it's like Randall said, being in the middle of the woods where he thinks it would be quiet, there's really a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise. And sometimes the lot of noise that you hear in the wilderness is good, but you hear a lot of noise even in the quiet of the church. Even if the church is perfectly quiet, if your head has a lot of noise, you need something to take that noise out of your head to prepare yourself for worship. I think that's all part of us listening. That's why I was talking about the spiritual listening to each other, is understanding that we all need something different to hear what the Spirit has to say to us. Sometimes we can go into the most quiet place and hear that whole idea of the small whisper of God to us. But I tell God a lot in my prayers, don't whisper. Throw a brick and hit me in the head, because I'm not going to hear you if you whisper to me. So that listening comes in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily come in the quiet. But I do believe this piece, this whole idea of preparing and centering, however you do it, is very important for worship, for how we commune with each other spiritually, how we commune with each other, with ourselves and God, how we allow God to commune with us. I say this to people, I've had people say, oh, you just get up there and preach your sermon, you just get up there and just start talking. But they don't understand that I have to prepare for that. One of my professors, actually one of the first, may have been the first preaching professor I had, Dr. Thomas, said you always have to prepare. The Spirit will always be there with you. But if you do not prepare, the Spirit may not give you what you need. And so part of what I feel like we do in worship and how we hear all of worship, because the sermon is a piece, it is a piece, but our prayer book is Scripture. Our prayer book is speaking to us. And so if we understand that, then when I go in, part of the freedom that I feel by preaching the way I preach is because the Spirit can speak to me even as I'm preaching. And it can speak to me in a way that I can talk to each of the congregations. And let's face it, we have 3 congregations. Yeah. They come from different places. And once you've been around each one of them, you know that. I mean, you truly understand that there are 3 different distinct understandings of who they are. And that allows me to speak to each congregation in that tone. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody is in sync in each service, but I mean, at least for me, I can tell you that this group I need to present this way, this group I need to present this way, and this group. So it's either prepare and let the Spirit sort of move, or I write a sermon and you're all going to get the same thing. And you're not going to get the same thing, and some may not get anything. Because I've taken this, for me, I will say that. There are some people who do script preaching, and it works great. But for me, I don't think the Spirit moves when I write a script out and follow that script like it does when I prepare myself. I sort of have this mental outline, and most of the time it works. There are times when I get up there and at the end of the sermon I thought, oh, that was horrible. This past week, I really, truly felt so good about Saturday's sermon. I did not feel good about my 10:30 sermon. Mm-hmm. Yet Timothy listened to both of them, and he liked the 10:30 better. Mm-hmm. So it just goes to show that the Spirit really does work, and people hear what they're meant to hear if you do the work. But it's part of that preparing and centering ourselves, because the people that come, all of you that come to be a part of the service, are preparing, hopefully, and preparing and centering yourselves to be there and to be responsive and hearing what the Spirit has to say. When I stand there and I say to you, let these words be your words, and if they're not your words, they write your words in our hearts and our minds. I truly mean that. If the Spirit is not putting those words into my mouth and having them come out, and they aren't mine, they're yours, then I hope that the Spirit will write what you need on your hearts and minds, whether the words ever come out of me. I've told this story before, and I don't know if you've all heard it before, but I can remember one sermon I preached, and this person came up to me at the back and said, oh my gosh, that was just what I needed to hear. I just loved it when you said this, and this. And I'm like, I didn't say any of those things. I said none of that. And I mean, we were recording it just like we do now. And I thought, I need to go back and listen. Because I know I didn't say those things, and I listened to it, and I hadn't said those. But I think that goes back to hearing from your spirit. You don't necessarily have to hear my words. We don't have to hear each other's words to feel the Spirit from each other, to truly, the body language, all of these things we talked about in our listening is bigger than just us. It's God working through us all the time if we open ourselves up to it. It is hearing where somebody else comes from as well when we're talking about the differences between people of color and their experience in this country, and people who are white coming to this country, people who may be of a different economic stance. Maybe you came from someone where you were very, very poor and have come up economically, or maybe didn't. Or maybe you started out up here and your economic level dropped. It's more than just hearing that from people. It's hearing each other from the perspective of what I say, we should be listening and seeing each other through the Jesus lenses. And if we do that, then we're truly going to listen to each other in a whole different way than I think we typically do. Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
I was just thinking about the centering part. I typically prepare for the end of the week by reading the lectionary for, Sunday, well, Saturday. And but I center myself when I come in, and I kneel and say those prayers. That's a centering thing for me. One of the things that always helps me is to ask God to give me ears to hear the message He wants me to hear. Because see, to me, hearing means understanding. It is automatic. You're absolutely right. I never thought about it that way, and I'm nervous, but it is an automatic thing. But I can not really, take it all in if I don't concentrate. If I don't try to understand what's being said. It's those voices that get in the way.
I'm probably spelling this wrong, but, you know, I think of things like the noises, the sanctus bells. It sort of, it does something different. I mean, it gives you these clues, these cues to, okay, what does that say? When those are rung, those kinds of things, I think, the organ playing, it gives you that clue that, okay, it's time to really get ready because the prelude's playing. It's that sort of, okay, we're about to begin.
What are sanctus bells?
They're these little bells. There's 4 of them. And they're typically rung to sort of remind you of the Trinity. So they're typically rung 3 times for the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. In a lot of churches, and if we regather, you'll probably hear them some. Some people like them, some people don't. They're typically done around the Eucharist. When we sing the Holy, 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 they'll ring them. They also, at times, they'll ring them at the elevation of the sacraments during the Eucharistic prayer. And so, 8 o'clock doesn't do it as much. 10:30 used to do it a whole lot more than actually 8 o'clock because John doesn't like it.
And we never do it on Saturdays.
Never do it on Saturdays.
A long time ago they did.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
A long time.
Because Saturday, I mean, we typically are in the chapel.
Go church.
And so, well, and we're in the chapel. So the sanctus bells are always in the name. And so that's another thing. But that doesn't mean it can't be incorporated. It's those cues, it's those noises that can remind us of where we are and what we're doing. What other noises do you trigger you in a worship service of something?
Well, I know for me, I'll go over when it gets close to time for church to start. I usually go over to the clothes closet, the food pantry, partially because I'm listening to it over there, so I can text him and go, hey, this isn't working, or hey, something's going on. And hearing you ring the bell out in the garden. There you go. I know that means it's about to start. I need to make sure I have my phone out so that I'm watching.
Some churches have, I'm talking about bells, some churches have the high-pitched tri-bells, you know, there's 3 of them together, and then at Lent, some of them bring out a big bell that they bong,
Oh. You know, you think about it.
It's a Texas thing, you know.
And you know, you think in meditation, sometimes what are the pots? The meditative
Pots, those things.
the meditative pots that you, what are they?
All I can think of is Zen garden, but I don't think that's.
Yeah, but there's a name for the, I'm sorry?
I don't know, I can't think of it.
I can't think of it, even, you know, those, sometimes you hear them. Yeah, it makes a noise. I used to have some on my phone. It really, let's see, where is that? It was interesting because somebody was talking about it today. They've incorporated it into this rapper is using it. She looks as if she's from Japanese descent, and that may not be right, but and her name sounds that way as well. But she incorporates it into her rap music, and it's really become very popular. What's her name, Zoe? You should know.
That would be a good question.
What is that? How do I find that?
Well, in Islam, they call to prayer.
Oh, yeah.
That is so melodious. It's such a melodious, to me, it's a beautiful sound when you hear that, the way they sing.
Growing up, I had a sister that was Buddhist,
the monks chant psalms. If you ever go to a monastery and go to one of their services. Here we go.
We saw that at Sudieta, didn't we?
Oh.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we do.
See, I told you I had one. This one is called a heart bowl. And then there's Sanghi.
And what do they look like?
I'm sorry.
What do they look like? Oh, cool, yes, 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 okay.
So they're just little, and so that might be another, then they have the really deep one, called the foot bowl.
Growing up, my granddad was the preacher at Arnold United Methodist. And one of the things that we had a bell that we rang. But it was kind of a twofold thing. It was one of those where we knew once we rang the bell, we had to go in and sit down and be quiet and at least semi-pay attention. Or be quiet. We could just accomplish to be quiet. But it was also one of those, it was kinesthetic because right beside the rope for the bell was a door that went up onto the altar area. So we got to open the door and we'd stand up on the step up, grab the bell, and we had to jump off to ring the bell. And it was one of those things that was like you get the energy out and you go sit down. The bell means go sit down. But it's one of those things where even now, I love listening to church bells.
Anything else you can think of that kind of relates to listening or how we gather spiritually? What?
Well, Sylvia was talking about how it mentions listening to our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a biggie because in order to be able to get into that center mindset, if there's something, I know for me, if there's something that's bugging me or if I'm anxious about something, it's a lot harder to get to that. So, acknowledging that. If it's something that I need to talk to somebody about, if it's something that I need to handle, doing that first instead of trying to be able to focus, because I know my mind's going to wander. Zoe's been texting me, and she's actually paying attention because she's actually commenting on things that go with what we're talking about. And she was talking about, in a really quiet place, she can hear all of the noises. I told her, I was like, me too. That's like I'll be sitting there and I will start, praying or, really listening. And next thing I know, I'm halfway through a grocery list and I have no idea how I would come from point A to point B. So if I had anything at all, in the back of my mind, I have to attend to that first before I can focus and center and get ready to actually worship. Because otherwise, it's like a ladybug, and I'm not going to pay it.
Well, that's what is, if you have a dispute with your brother or sister, go and solve it before you come to the altar. I think it's the same for our body. If we have something going on, that we need to solve that. We need to address that. Even if we can't make it right, we address it and we come to some sort of terms with it in order to be open to worship. I think that really does speak to the whole idea of even Jesus going into the temple. The people are not coming to worship, they're coming to sort of fulfill this obligation, to do the rubrics of the service, and then they leave and they haven't gotten anything out of it. And I'm sure that we all have done that at some point, come and just went through the motions. But I think what this is calling us to is to how are we being attentive to that? How are we recognizing in this time of Lent, how do we bring ourselves back to a center place to truly listen? Listen to ourselves, listen to each other, and listen to God. And are we truly allowing ourselves to do that?
There is a song called Going Through the Motions. Hoping I'm finding the right one and not. That's not.
I love the question that he ends the writing with, what is going on around you today that you are not listening to? There's not much more where what we are, obviously. So we make ourselves pay attention to what it is that I'm not listening to. So things that I would, I try to do that when I go for a walk. I try to be quiet. I don't want to have music when I go for a walk because in neighborhoods, I really like to be able to listen to things that I wouldn't otherwise hear. Pay attention to different sounds. And then you can extend that to, social issues, like what is it that there's a lot going around even in this town that I'm not aware of, that I'm not listening to, or I know that there's hunger, there's injustice, and there's despair and loneliness, but I'm not really paying attention to that, I'm just ignoring it. I know it's out there, I know that I choose not to listen to it.
Right, and we've talked on one side of the coin, which I think we tend to do more so, but just the whole idea of the world around us right now, we have people saying, but you haven't been listening to me. There's this whole other side that we struggle, some of us struggle, with hearing, that we feel like we've heard you, and we feel like you've had all this power and all this control for so long. But I think what we miss is that that's all true. But that doesn't mean you stop listening. Because to have that and then to have it just stripped away, we need to hear those voices too. We need to hear people on both sides and say, yes, things change. I love Michael Morton used to always, he would always say, yes, change is good, you go first. And I think we miss that piece. We don't mind listening. We feel obligated and we want to hear one side, even though we may not understand it. But yet there's another side that we tend to ignore, and we really need to hear them. It doesn't mean that what they want is what we need to do, but they need to be heard. Everyone needs to be heard. Because if we don't listen to each other, that's how we get into the positions we're in now. We have to listen to each other and truly hear each other, even if it is to say, I hear you, but life has changed. The world has changed. And how do we help you change with it? How do we help you see that we really are listening to you, if we are? I think we're missing an opportunity there to truly hear everyone's perspective and say, how is it that we hear you, even though we don't necessarily agree with you? How do we listen to you?
I like what you said, that I hear you. Life has changed. Things aren't the way they used to be. But for some, and it sounds like maybe for you, there are still things that have not, maybe there are things that I have not changed, and I need to learn. I need to learn what that perspective is.
And I think that's true. I think that's true. From my perspective, I grew up in that area. That's the way, this voice that I struggle with is a voice I know well. quit hearing them. I quit truly listening to them. And I think in some cases I have. And I think in some cases many of us have.
Right.
If we ever listened to them in the first place. But I don't think that's what God is calling us to do. I still think that our call is to listen to everyone and to find a way to try and help. That doesn't, we can't, you can, what is it, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. But you can at least listen in a sense of, is the horse thirsty? Is it hungry? Or does it just need some time by itself to move? And I don't think we do that very well. We tend to pick things that we want to hear and listen to, and we forget that everyone has a voice, whether we deem it correct or not. And as people of faith, and I say this, and I really mean it when I say it, is as people of faith, we have to be the example. Even if it means that sometimes it seems we're not being as supportive of the goal we want to see because we're trying to help others move that direction. If we don't lead, who will? If we as people of faith don't say, yes, those masks are important when we go into public. The vaccine is important for us to get. That it's important. I understand that you're tired of it. I hear you. I really hear you. But in order for us to move together as a society, I need to help you understand why it's important and ask you, not necessarily for you, but for someone you love to make it through this, to wear the mask. And I think we forget that sometimes. I really do. I don't think we truly hear it. We call it selfish. I've called it selfish. I'll admit it. Because we're not hearing with sort of the ears of God. And I think we as a people of faith have to reorganize our listening so that we hear people from all areas and listen for how we can find a way through to be a more perfect people, more people based on what Jesus has called us to be. And I certainly have a long way to go. I'm certainly not pointing the finger at anybody because I think it's all of us.
It's a journey. It's a journey.
It is a journey. People think it's just a short trip, but it's really not. It's a lifetime journey, and we can't leave anyone behind because the reality is, whether we like it or not, there's not petitions in heaven or partitions in heaven. They're not going to be those over there and them over there. We're all going to be there together. And if we say the Lord's Prayer and we truly want heaven here as it is there, then we all have to work together to get there.
There's a story I used to share with my students. It's about, it basically has to do with perception and understanding and asking the right questions. And it was about a young married couple, and the wife was fixing, you could say, ham or roast or whatever, and she cut off the end. And her new husband wanted to know why. Well, it's because my mother always cut off the end. And so he asked his new mother-in-law, well, why cut off the end of the ham before you bake it? And she said, well, because my mother always did. That's how I learned, right? So then, Christmas, whenever it was, they were all together. And, that's the only way. The wife said she knew how to bake the ham was to cut off the end. So the new husband asked the grandmother, why is it that you cut off the end of the ham? And she said, well, I had to do it because I didn't have a big enough pan. So asking the right questions. Why do we do that? Why, help me understand why you feel that way. I want to know. I want to understand. Why are you, because I'm white, or because I'm female, or whatever, or because you're male. Should I automatically think that you're going to look down on me because you're male and I'm female? Because males have historically had a prominent position in our society. You know, for a long time, they were the only ones that could sit on a jury. They voted, we could.
Own land. I mean,
Yeah.
on and on.
So if I go forward with that thought and don't find out what you are as a person, you know, then there's.
Why you cut the ends off the hand?
Yeah, why do you have prejudice that, or misunderstanding that is unnecessary?
Yeah. All right, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the quiet and for the noise. We thank you for allowing us to hear and to listen. We ask that you would help us to ask the right questions so that we might hear our fellow human beings, our fellow children of God, so that we might be one people, so that we might understand the love that you have for us and see the love in each other, to see you in each other, so that we might be the people you have called us to be, listening and hearing through the quiet or the noise, so that we might journey together in the path that you have led us on. And we ask and pray all of us in Christ's holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.